Good morning, everybody. Bonjour, welcome. We'll get going. My name is Nancy Hansen, and in my day job, I'm a strategic advisor for the Department of Western Economic Diversification with the Government of Canada. And in my other day job, I'm the vice chair of the Edmonton Regional Group IPAC board. So welcome to this third Café Pracademique. It promises to be a really interesting day. And because I'm with the feds, I can actually make this joke because I was looking at the room and how people were seated. I was just noticing with the change in government, there seems to be a heavy left-leaning tendency to the room here. I don't know what's going on, but anyway, we're all nonpartisan, we know that, right? So that's just whatever. Well, listen, for those of you who don't know, IPAC stands for the Institute of Public Administration of Canada. It's a dynamic association of public servants from all orders of government, as well as academics and others interested in public administration. IPAC's mission is to promote excellence in public service by encouraging the highest standards of public practice and service to the public, expanding and exchanging information and knowledge, and contributing to the resolution of key issues in public administration, and promoting the education and professional development of public administrators through national and regional conferences and events such as this one, which offer an opportunity for colleagues of all orders of government and academia and others to discuss common issues that they face. The Edmonton Regional Group is one of 18 groups across the country. We used to be the largest after the national conference because when you get a national conference in your city, it attracts a lot of people locally. We're now the second largest group with around 600 members. We have members from the provincial, as you know, and federal governments, from the City of Edmonton, St. Albert, Strathcona County, the County of Leduc, and the University of Alberta, just to mention a few. So for more information on IPAC and how to learn about and join the upcoming events, please visit us at ipac.ca/Edmonton. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors for this event who have contributed to making today's event a possibility. I want to thank Alberta Human Services, Service Alberta, KPMG, and Myers Norris Penny. Speaking of today's event, we have an exceptional lineup of thought leaders that are joining us today under the theme of #GovConnect, Advancing Inclusive Digital Services. And we also have all of you here today with your own knowledge, experience, and various talents that we hope to be putting to good use. I have an old quote that I use all the time, and it's, "The smartest person in the room is the room." So we expect you to be participating very actively today. Together we'll unpack the theme of public services delivered digitally and inclusively around access to those services. When you arrive, you should have received a package that outlines the agenda for today. As well, the package has a briefing note and an infographic that provides some additional background information and lays the groundwork for our work today. So allow me to briefly outline for you the structure today. As you will have already seen on the agenda, the first half of the day in the morning will be treated to 3 different thought leaders or speakers that will engage us on stimulating topics. These presentations will provide you with background, context, and food for thought, and lay the foundation for the theme. Keeping in mind that each thought leader will present their own perspective on the theme, this will be followed by a Q&A session. So we encourage you to jot down your questions, comments, and thoughts as they're speaking because you'll have the opportunity to contribute to a lively discussion afterwards. We'll have Mark Dinner start us off with a broad discussion around digital inclusivity. Mark's over there. This will be followed by Nancy Hansen, Nancy's over here, who will discuss what access to the internet has meant for disabled people and what inclusivity really means. And then just before the lunch break, we'll hear from Bev Matthiessen. Bev is over there. Thanks, Bev. Who will touch on the lack of understanding people often have of those with disabilities and the accessibility barriers that they face. We'll have about a 45-minute lunch halfway through the day. Lunch will be buffet style, just available outside as you walked in. When you walk back out, it'll be to your right. After lunch, we'll engage you in a series of smaller breakout sessions. These will be in a workshop format where you will have the opportunity to consider several key questions and brainstorm some ideas on solutions. Now this morning at registration, you'll have received a piece of paper that indicates which group you belong to for the breakout sessions. Please note that you should have 2 numbers, which means that the second breakout session you'll be sitting in on you'll be sitting in with a different set of folks. If you have any questions about where you need to go, please speak to one of our helpful volunteers who you have been greeted at the front. Each group will have a supporting facilitator and a note taker to help guide and record the discussion. The first breakout session will look at a statement of principles for the provision of inclusive digital services that takes into consideration the needs of people with disabilities. The second breakout session will consider menu options for how improved and more inclusive digital services could be delivered. So the day has been structured so that each session builds upon the last and takes us to our final outcome for the day. Following the breakout sessions, our lead facilitator, Catherine Landreth, who's right here, will summarize the results of the discussions from various breakout sessions. So this will give us a high-level common understanding of what different conversations have touched upon. Keep in mind that the notes from the sessions will be used later to refine and work on the final statement of principles and the menu options. At the end of the day, your contributions will have shaped and formed a statement of principles and a menu of options designed to guide public servants and to improve self-service delivery of government services through digital means for people with disabilities, with some tangible next steps that will implement the plan. Now, we all know everyone's very busy with work commitments. However, the organizing committee would like to ask you to turn your mobile devices to silent, please. And if you need to make a call, we'd ask you to please do so outside of this room. So to get us started, our thought leaders will dive right into the topic, share their own perspectives. So allow me to make a few introductions. Allow me to introduce Mark Dinner, who has been working in the public service since 1999 in evolving positions of responsibility. Mark was appointed as Chief Advisor and Executive Director of Open Government for the Government of Alberta in 2012. Mark has overseen the growth of the Open Government program to now include the largest subnational open data portal in Canada, together with an open information citizen library and the emergence of an enterprise data analytics strategy integrated within open government. I have no idea what I just read, Mark, so I'm looking forward to your presentation. Today we also have Nancy Hansen, who's Director of the Interdisciplinary Master's Program in Disability Studies at the University of Manitoba. Nancy has obtained her PhD from the University of Glasgow. Her thesis examined the impact of education and social policy on the employment experiences of women with disabilities. Nancy's postdoctoral research, also at the University of Glasgow, examined women with disabilities' access to primary health care. Nancy is also past president of the Canadian Disability Studies Association. Bev Matthiessen. Since 1991, Bev has been the Executive Director of the Alberta Committee of Citizens with Disabilities, an organization promoting full participation in society by Albertans with disabilities. In 1998, she was instrumental in the creation of the Alberta Disabilities Forum, a partnership of over 40 disability organizations that have come together to have a united voice on disability issues. In her years of service, Bev has actively participated in numerous committees, including the Ministers' Employability Council, the Edmonton Regional Airports Authority Barrier-Free Committee, the Persons with Disabilities, Developmental Disabilities Partners Committee, the Hate Bias Provincial Strategy Committee, and the International Day of Persons with Disabilities Planning Committee. I love this. With small town Saskatchewan roots, there's lots of you here. We know that. That's great. Bev is best known for her hard work and tireless dedication to social justice, believing in equality and fairness for all, including equity, accessibility, and full participation for citizens with disabilities. And our lead facilitator for the day is Catherine Landreth, who leads Service Alberta's Open Government Division, responsible for transforming the way GOA manages, protects, shares, and realizes the full value of its information. She has served as an ADM for approximately 11 years, leading major change initiatives in several large divisions, and was a member of the executive team supporting the Premier's Council for Economic Strategy. During her 31-year career with the GOA, Catherine has had the opportunity to establish, lead, and support numerous cross-government committees, councils, and teams. So, after all that, it's my pleasure to get the day kicked off by having Mark come up and give us his presentation. So please welcome Mark Dinner.
Test. So I guess the fact that Can everyone hear? Let's just do a sound check. If you're very back of the room, you can hear. Okay. I guess the fact that my bio wasn't understood is a lesson for me in terms of inclusivity of language from government's perspective to other citizens. So, lesson for Mark, number one. We've already got one lesson learned, and we're 1 minute into the session, and I haven't even proceeded to the first slide. This is a picture of Alberta's first legislature from May 1906. This was the beginning of the province of Alberta, and as you can see from this picture, it's a very exclusive bunch of folks who are pictured here. I think it's the amount of facial hair that's the distinguishing feature from all of these folks. So, as we consider where we are today and where we've come from, we have gone a long way. But think about these gentlemen. And who can tell me, as we start off, who was the first premier of Alberta? Sorry? Rutherford. And which party was in power in 1906? The Liberals. Our first premier was Alexander Rutherford. He was from Edmonton, Strathcona, the riding, which is the same riding as our current premier, my riding. And he's pictured here somewhere, probably right at the center. So as you think about Alberta in 1906, and as the first legislatures were getting underway, think about inclusivity and what these gentlemen could do. So no matter their intent to be as inclusive as possible, and as representative to the citizens as possible, how really inclusive could they have been back in 1906? So think about, for example, their relationship with a farmer in Olds who had an idea for government, who wanted to participate. What could they have done back in 1906 to be more inclusive, to be more open? What could they have done? It would have been a journey for that farmer in Olds to be able to travel up to Edmonton and then to arrange a meeting in a boardroom with these gentlemen. So no matter their intent, it was difficult. Information didn't flow as it does today. Communication was slow. The sharing of information was difficult. Information was physically held. And so no matter that it was the democratic intent of all of these gentlemen to participate with openly and transparent with citizens, there was physical constraints, there was physical boundaries in place. And so as we think about the difference between today and 1906, one of the things we have to think about is where we've come from, and the systems of government, the Westminster systems, the structures of government, the way that the bureaucracy operates and manages with the politicians. Many of those structures remain in place today. And so we're going to explore some of those over the next hour. This is a brief history of open government, so another bit of a history lesson here. And this will help set the stage as we explore open government going forward. But before I do that, I'd like to find out, by a show of hands, who here barely understands or barely knows what open government is? By a show of hands. So there's a few of you. So what we'll attempt to do is describe the relationship between open government and inclusivity over the next little while as well. So, open government. As early as 1942, and he wasn't the only one. He was a sociologist who really pushed from his, I can't remember which university, but it was in California. He really pushed his colleagues into seeking to share research data and information. And he wrote a number of papers on how which caused the beginning of the open science movement back in 1942. And he set the stage for what later on computer scientists would begin to develop with respect to open source software. So about 1998, the open source movement was born, and it really was an evolution from the internet. And it was with the release of Netscape Navigator, which was an early browser, and it was put out as open code. And what it did was it began to show what could happen with the sharing of computer code and the outcomes from that. And that was the rapid development of browser technologies, internet browser technologies. And so that combined with the beginning of the social web, so Facebook, Twitter, the idea that you could engage on the internet in a dialogue, formed the basis of a meeting that happened back in 2007, where these two gentlemen, Tim O'Reilly and Lawrence Lessig, founded the principles of open government. And so these principles went on to influence, and in parallel with some of the work that Obama had done in a very successful campaign using social technologies. And he created, back in 2008, the White House briefing on transparency and open government. That set the stage later on for the formation of the Open Government Partnership in September 2011 and the G8 Open Data Charter in 2013. The Open Government Program here in Alberta was formed in November 2012. And so the archaeology, the architectures of this series of events helped write the open government principles. And so I'll share those now, and I'm going to read each one of these. And I promise this will be the only reading of bullets I do for the course of the presentation. So the first principle, open by design, the principle is to increase accessibility of government information and data in a way that is responsive to citizens' needs and expectations. To embed a culture of being open by default within the Alberta Public Service. The second principle, with respect to innovation from quality data, is that we will publish quality government information and data to empower citizens and businesses to derive value from government information. We will leverage technology to enable efficient and timely access to quality information and data for an increasingly technologically enabled population. Improve governance, enable public participation in the development of government policy, programs, and services through the timely publication of quality information and data. And finally, to utilize government data and information to identify opportunities to improve service delivery and efficiency in government. So these are the principles we have adopted within the government of Alberta with respect to open government. And they, as the previous slide showed, the archaeology of these principles was formed from the beginnings of the open source movement previous to that. So, this is a model that we use within open government that describes the major components of our program. And the first, the blue semicircle, is with respect to transparency. That we will eliminate barriers and promote opportunity for the sharing of data and information. Second, with respect to the green semicircle, and that's participation. And that is that the voice of all citizens should be listened to and be able to participate in the design of government policy and in the delivery of government services. But what that means in the red semicircle is that we have to change the way that we collaborate. We have to break the silos. We have to leverage the technologies that are available for us to create a horizontal movement in terms of program design, rather than the traditional vertical program development models that we're used to. So this model is posted in our offices, and it really forms the basis of how we think open government and inclusivity in this case, as we move forward. So let's take a pause and let's do a thought experiment. What if we were to find ourselves on an island with, say, 100,000 citizens, and we were a product manager, and what we were told to do was redesign government however we see fit. But on this island, we've got a data center, and every one of these citizens is given a smartphone. We have full access to be able to design technologies as we could. What sort of government would we design? A government based on the principles of democracy. What would it look like? How would decision making happen? How would citizens involve themselves in the design of of government? How would citizens involve themselves in the delivery of government services on this island? Think about that. And the gap, the delta between the designs that we came up with for this island and the way that government currently works today, those are our barriers. Those are the things that we have to think about changing or improving to the extent that we believe that we can. So let's talk about 3 barriers to inclusive digital design or open government. What I'd like to do as we work through these barriers is to get your opinion on some of them. So as we've talked about before, the Westminster system of government did not contemplate digital technologies. It wasn't built around open source or open license. So our first barrier is really structural. Now we're not going to change the Westminster system, and I'm not talking about that, but what can we do? How do we balance the current Westminster system against that island that I had talked about in the previous slide? So our first barrier is structural. It's really that we are looking at open government from a lens that may not structurally fit well with our current systems of government. The second is around the fact that open government, digital services, the ideas of those came from the open source movement, came from computer scientists. And they paint with a very broad brush the application of open government across all sorts of political systems. So there's a number of reports that have been written that look at open government. And for example, their case studies are with respect to municipal governments, the government in Estonia, in Brazil, in Portugal, in Alberta, in Edmonton, and for the federal government. And it's very difficult to paint broadly the idea of being open government across all sorts of different political systems. The implementation of each of those differs. And so again, one of the barriers is that we're trying to broadly approach the implementation of open government based on the open source movement initially against the political system. And we have to consider how those structures have to adopt, or how the implementation of open government has to adopt to fit into the government structures that we've got in place today. So that's our first barrier. The second barrier is our cultural barriers. You've seen all of these barriers in many different instances with some of the various projects that you've been working on in the past. So as you consider policy, have you considered policy changes in the past, and you've thought about what are some of the barriers that you have to consider? These have come up again and again. So broadly, the first barrier is the fact that we have to change the hearts and minds of each one of us. And we get to work, we open up our email, we spend our day in the cubicle, we go to meetings, we go back, we look at our email, go back to meetings, and repeat the same thing day after day after day. So what are we going to change? How are we going to expand our thinking if we remain in our cubicles? Do I have permission to be inclusive? Who do I ask for that? Who does my boss ask? And then we get into the idea of the structural, the structures of the governance systems that we have to think about. How do I be inclusive? What's my manual to do this? Of course, fear of the unknown. When I started in government back in 1999, the very first course I took was a FOIP course. It was on the idea that we have to protect, and it's how important it is to protect people's privacy, and for the next 10, 12 years, all of the design thinking that I had was always around protecting the privacy and secrecy of individuals. That hasn't gone away, but now we've added another layer in terms of transparency. So how does that work together? And of course, the idea of enterprise thinking. We work in our individual programs, but citizens don't see it that way. So for us to be successful with being inclusive, we have to begin to think of government as one GOA. So I'm going to pause here now and ask you, are there any other, if you have any other cultural barriers that you'd like to raise? Just put up your hand or shout out, whatever you can imagine. Anything?
How about demographics, age gaps between people who are in different age groups, that would be cultural barriers?
So cultural barriers with respect to demographics, age, that's a good one. Anything else?
Knowledge,
Knowledge?
having familiarity with the digital world.
Right.
Typically, we look at the 80-20 and forget about the 20%, which is where we find the disabled falling under.
Yeah, design for the 80-20 is instead of the 100% that we've been talking about,
Correct.
inclusivity. We're going to actually talk about that a little bit more. Yes, Roger?
Information is power. Sometimes we want to keep all information to feel that we have the power.
Information is power, and the control of that. Okay, great. Any others?
Well, it gets back to, we work in the Westminster model where we have to protect our political masters, and so we have to pay attention to that, I guess.
So the intersection of design for political requirements versus design for bureaucratic requirements, for sure. Okay. So there's no end of cultural requirements. We, about 2 years ago, we met with a team from Belgium who talked about some of the barriers they had with respect to open government. And they'd actually identified what they said, maybe jokingly, they had 27 barriers that they identified so far. So there's lots of risks, there's lots of steps to mitigate. Let's look at some opportunities. Oh, I forgot. How could I forget this barrier? We have some technical barriers as well. And many of these barriers were around are around information sharing. So you can't be inclusive if you don't properly share with those who you want to be inclusive to. So what are some of the barriers we have with respect to the sharing of information? And the first is that when we designed our information systems, starting in the 1970s and 80s and up until even today, we designed with respect to a particular program's requirements. Typically, when you design IT systems, you do your requirements gathering, you go to your stakeholders that you're comfortable with, and you ask them to help in your requirements gathering. And typically, you hit the 80-20 rule on your requirements. But you could only build up to an 80-20 rule. And so one of the requirements that's just now starting to emerge is the ability to be transparent with the way that the information is managed. If we can't be transparent, we can't be inclusive. IT systems in the past weren't built that way, and it's very challenging for us to be able to extract information from those systems and share. Second, forever, the information, and this is again around power, but around revenue in this case, the information that we collect, sometimes we sell, or sometimes we have exclusive arrangements for the distribution of that information. And so those contracts that are in place today limit our ability to share information. And so we'll have to consider what is the value of our information? Is it only for the purposes of that contract, or does the information have value that's broader and needs to be considered for all citizens to be able to look at? One of the principles of open government says that all information should be shared with citizens, regardless of that, unless, of course, it's got confidential or secret information in it. And so that conflicts with the fact that we do have exclusive arrangements and we do sell our information and our data. On the other hand, as governments, as in Alberta, we all know that right now we're seeking opportunities for revenue desperately. We're seeking to balance the budget. And if our information does have a financial value to it, maybe we should sell that information or that data, because that helps us with our balancing our fiscal situation. So how do we be inclusive? On the one hand, honor the contracts on the other hand. We're going to have to think about that. And we'll have to, and it could be on a case-by-case basis. And secondly, again, is the idea of maintaining privacy, respecting the private and security needs of citizens. And in that, we have to be very careful with with how that information is passed from department to department. And so that need to be careful has created all sorts of MOUs, memorandum of understanding, which is an agreement between one ministry and the other ministry to share that information. And we've got all sorts of contracts within government which describe how we will share that information. I've heard we've got over 10,000 or more MOUs across government that describe that sharing of the information. It's darn hard to be inclusive with the sharing of information if it's subject to thousands and thousands of contracts. We're going to have to think about that as well. So we do have some technical and legacy barriers as well. Are there any other technical barriers that you can think of in the room? All right, so that's probably captured most of those.
Actually, there is one that
Oh, yeah.
for the consumers of the data, if it's open governance and it's going to citizens, the disabilities that those individuals may have may require certain sets of technology that we would need to be aware of in order to ensure that our technological solutions are enabling those technology tools to be used.
So the barrier there is that they were designed to be accessed by the general public, the 80-20 rule, and they may not have been designed for example, the blind. Yeah.
We don't have blind testers.
Don't have what?
Blind testers.
We don't have the way that we design systems. There's not a use case around someone who is blind, for example, and that hasn't been designed into the system itself. So more on that a little bit later.
Mark, there may be one other, and it might fall into your last point, but there's also court cases now where governments between departments in the past shared information, where the courts have said, no, if you collect information, it has to be just for that use unless you let the person that you're collecting it from know it will be used for multiple.
So there are definitely legal barriers as well that we'll have to consider. And really that's just the court's interpretation of the laws that we have. But those laws we do have, and they could create barriers to the sharing of our information. Okay, thank you. So opportunities, and I'm going to ask you to participate in this as well. We'll review these 4 opportunities: more open government, design for inclusivity. We're going to look at some digital services, and of course, innovation. So, are there any PhDs in geometry in this room? Because I'm going to break a whole bunch of mathematical rules, and you would be very critical, but since there are none, I'm probably safe. So, the 3 circles on your left, sorry, I was mixing up right and left, so I had to turn this way, describe our current, the current way that we design for policy within the government of Alberta. So I stole this from our policy folks from memory, so if it's wrong, I do apologize. But essentially, the interactions with respect to policy design are based on the interactions of citizenry, our politicians, and the bureaucracy. And so, from a bureaucratic point of view, we share information with our citizenry. We design policy recommendations to our politicians. In the case today, that's called a cabinet decision document, I believe. In the past, it's been a ministerial report or a cabinet C2.
They're now cabinet reports.
Oh, the cabinet reports. Sorry. So there's the relationship between the bureaucracy and the politicians, and then of course the relationship between the politicians and the citizenry happens every 4 years on election, or it might happen through town halls sponsored by our politicians, of course managed with the help of the bureaucracy. The green shading is the overlap. So if we were to take that concept and add it to the concept of more transparency, better collaboration, and more participation, then what we would do is we would, and this is very complicated, we would grow the shaded areas. So we would, through better collaboration, we would be able to present horizontally produced or better policy recommendations that were more inclusive. By better sharing of information between the bureaucracy and the citizens, we therefore inform citizens, and we're able to enhance the ability of citizens to participate in the political processes. By providing digital tools, we should also be able to grow the ability for citizens to participate, be more inclusive, and offer a stronger town hall experience, again, through digital tools. For those who can't, who don't have time, who don't have access, who don't have ability to participate in town halls, why not participate through digital tools, for example? So the idea here is we have an opportunity with open government, with digital services, to grow the shaded intersections much more broadly and be more inclusive, develop better partnerships. The second opportunity is around designing for inclusivity. There's an organization out of the United States, it's called IDEA, and their website is idea.org. And what they have developed is a toolkit for government departments, for agencies, to design services to be more inclusive. So there's a whole toolkit. There's over 100 pages of PDF that you can download that describe how we might design to be more inclusivity. I'm gonna offer three different. Idea.org will offer. I'm gonna highlight three different examples from idea.org, but I would encourage you to go to that website and look at the entire toolkit, and then we'll talk about some ideas from you as well. So the first is around empathy. So we cannot properly design IT solutions if we're not empathetic to those who we're designing for. So for the idea of a blind tester that you talked about, we need to be able to do that if we're going to have proper design of IT solutions. You can't. I was at a conference in Banff, and I saw a bunch of people one person who was blind, another person who had their leg up, and for a day, a person in a wheelchair for a day. And the idea of that was that unless you experienced the disability, you couldn't properly begin to design around that. So what this means also is that we can't just invite the same old stakeholders that we usually invite as we think about solutions. We have to consider all citizens. It's very easy for us to get in the trap of speaking to the same old people, but I think the only way to have empathy for those when we're designing policy solutions is to be inclusive. Second, optimism. This is a strange concept from a design perspective. But the idea here is that it's amazing what you can't do when you think you can't do it. So it's the corollary of that, it's amazing what you can do when you decide that you can. Colin Powell talks about optimism as a force multiplier. I think it's important that we have to believe that inclusive design is possible, and so to be able to have energy to be able to do this, I think, requires optimism. Again, this was talked about earlier, that we have to design for the extremes. It's not the 80-20 rule, it's the 100% rule. How do we balance the design for 100% against our current budgets and the project budgets that we're given? We'll have to think about that. But it means looking for those use cases that are outside of the norm, and we'll have to think about bringing in as broader range of citizens being open with that so that we can properly design. What other ideas have you got with respect to designing, inclusive design? Anything? Well, something to think about going forward later on into the afternoon. So, we have started, within the government of Alberta, we have started to look at digital services and to be more inclusive with those. Have we hit the 100% design from all of these? I would say no. I'm quite sure we haven't, but we're raising the bar. We're moving from a physical-only paradigm to a digital paradigm to be more inclusive. We'll talk about some unintended consequences in a few minutes. The first is around alberta.ca. The initial alberta.ca was designed from a government perspective, from a bureaucratic perspective. It was very difficult for the average citizen to be able to navigate the original alberta.ca because it was developed in bureaucraties. It's a language that my bio was evidently written in. And I think we have to think about plain language, but also not thinking how government thinks, thinking how citizens think. Open.alberta.ca, that's our website. And this was designed with the idea of reducing barriers to accessing our data and information. One of the ways that we've reduced our barriers is we have radically altered the terms and conditions of the copyright statement. So from the old perspective, we would put out information and then we would tell people that you can only use this if you've got express and written permission of the Public Affairs Bureau to use that. That's a barrier. How do you get permission from the Public Affairs Bureau to use information on the website? Well, you would email the Public Affairs Bureau and you'd ask them for permission. But it didn't say how to do that. And it was awfully confusing for citizens. So what we've done instead with the Open Government Portal is we've invited citizens to be able to use the information and the data that's on the portal with no restrictions. You don't have to ask anyone permission to use the information. And you can use the information for any reason you'd like, including for commercial purposes. Just in doing that, we're reducing barriers to being transparent with citizens. MyAlberta.ca, one of the examples here is access to your medical information. So if you want to know, in the past, if you wanted to get information about your own health, you would have to contact your doctor, and there was some bureaucracy, some potential fighting that had to happen there. MyAlberta.ca and the development of an upcoming patient portal will give you access to your medical information without having to fight the fights you've had in the past. Same with paying fines through eservices.alberta.ca. It means that you'll be able to get online and pay your fines. You don't have to go line up at a registry office to do that. That reduces barriers in terms of the delivery of government services. So we are moving the bar. We have a long way to go to finish that.
Just so there's no confusion, it's not myalberta.ca. If you go to that, it doesn't exist. It's id.alberta.ca. And then eServices is eServices.alberta.ca.
So what's the, from myalberta.ca, what's the right route?
It's id.alberta.ca.
ID? Okay, so id.myalberta.ca.
Not myalberta, just Alberta.
Oh, id.alberta.ca? Okay.
And then eServices is.
If you Google myalberta.ca, would you get to the right website?
No.
Okay.
We just did.
The myalberta.ca looks like it's owned by a third party who wants to sell it to us.
We've been trying to get the domain, but we don't own them yet.
More barriers. This is why this is really challenging. Okay, finally, an opportunity. We can't proceed on with changing anything if we don't embrace innovation. So there's 5 components of innovation that I'd like to talk about, and that we have to consider. The first is around diversity, diverse inspiration. By the way, this comes from the web. I stole it. I cited the business innovation culture. So diverse inspiration. This is the idea that you can't be innovative if you're talking to the same old people about the same old ideas all the time. You have to bring in a diversity of views. Very rarely will a light bulb moment come out in a busy day from the same old people. So this is very consistent with the idea of inclusivity. That and there's a virtual cycle. The more that you bring inspiration from an inclusive group, the more likely you will be to be innovative and change and be more innovative. So,
Mark,
yes.
sorry. I know you don't mean to be interrupted here, but I'm your boss, so I can. It just strikes me in this, in this environment of diversity, we should be also considering ensuring that our teams are diverse and we actually have representation of voices, not just in stakeholders, but within our teams.
So diversity within teams, absolutely. Which for me would raise a challenge to our folks from corporate human resources. But also, think about in 1906, the team that was in place. If the leader back in 1906 was asked, why does your cabinet look that way? He might say, because it's 1906. Today's cabinets are definitely more diverse and probably therefore should reflect more inspiration in terms of new services. So, resilient leadership. The idea here with innovation is it's not simple. And if, as leaders, we're not resilient, if we don't plow on, if we feel that even with a couple of mistakes we're going to carry on, we need resiliency. We need patience. We need to know that we can battle for the long run and not give up in the short term to be innovative. So, an experimental space. Where do these ideas? Where do we build them so that we can course correct? We need a place to be able to experiment so that we can drive innovation, not from idea to begin to materialize and become more firm and more standardized. Agile processes. Innovation is messy, and perhaps the best way is one step at a time. Course correct, go back, try it again, course correct. So build with agility, build incrementally, so that we can embrace innovation step by step by step, but also understand that a 3-year plan will probably need to change. The implementation of a 3-year idea will probably need to change as we learn and we course correct. And finally, what are the soft skills we need for innovation? How do we encourage employees? How do we encourage ourselves? So there's something from the heart we need to figure out to be innovative as well. These are the ideas from the business innovation culture. Do you have any other ideas to support innovation from the audience?
Yeah, I think government also has to start opening up and looking at the possibility of the cloud as well, and not be so afraid of cloud services.
So the idea here is to embrace from outside, not just cloud computing, but be able to see trends from outside government and think about how we might apply those. Yeah.
And I guess to that point, being a little bit less risk averse, being able to take a bit of challenge on.
Okay, so changing the risk culture as well. Yeah, for sure. And I think that speaks to the resilient leadership. Leaders need to look at those formulas a little bit differently.
I was just going to say, I think the city of Edmonton sort of led the way when we had the open data days where they bring in programmers and give them full access to their data sets, and then they came up with some very innovative ways of accessing that data.
So the comment there was around the city bringing in data scientists to look at their data and look at ideas. So, and the idea here is to be more diverse, to be more inclusive of stakeholders and people participating in the development of our solutions, not just the same old government folks as it is. So innovation is key. The formula, the mathematical formula for innovation, for diversity, I believe, for inclusion, definitely has innovation as part of that formula. We can't change if that change doesn't happen based on good ideas that comes from innovation. So there are some unintended consequences as we push forward on digital services. Of course, and this has been talked about, this was brought up a couple of times, but the idea of the digital divide. So as we become more and more digital, because it's a lot easier for people to engage in technology, well, who are we leaving out? This isn't just about those who didn't grow up with technology. This is also about, there's many aspects to this, but we have to move carefully as we think about moving digitally, and we have to think about the fact that government is for all citizens, not just the 80-20 rule, and that's going to be difficult for us to think about. The second unintended consequence is around algorithms. So, in this case, as we design algorithms that will, for example, approve citizens into a program, there might be an application process. The application process is done through technologies. The technologies pump out their algorithms, and the algorithms either accept or deny someone's participation in a program. Algorithms are cold. They don't have a heart. They don't understand the human exceptions, the human experience. And they may kick out folks who, for reasons that we haven't programmed, should not have been. So we have to think about the use of logic and code in terms of being able to bring citizens into programs or not, and where does the human factor fit in to these as well. So an unintended consequence in the idea of using big data, we've actually gone and kicked out those because they don't fit into some formulas that we've developed. Okay, for any other unintended consequences you can think of. Yeah, that.
I could think of you're not using the data in a critical manner and taking in other sources of knowledge. So as an example, I'd seen a demo of Edmonton's open data, and they were getting reports of graffiti and potholes and whatnot. And the neighborhood I used to live in, Cromwell, had very, very little reports. So they were saying how they were going to use this open data to prioritize service. And I happen to know that the reason Cromwell didn't have a lot of reports had nothing to do with the lack of problems there. There's still lots of graffiti and there's still lots of potholes. But it was because of the class culture and being a low-income neighborhood, these weren't people that were used to saying, oh, I'm going to report this to the city of Edmonton. These were people who looked at it and felt not very empowered and just moved on. So if they were to rely on that algorithm without taking other factors into place and looking at that, they could actually have the net result of prioritizing resources to neighborhoods that don't need it as much and sort of leaving it out ones that do.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Thank you for that. Did everybody hear that? If not, you can. I won't repeat it all, but it was a great example. Okay. How are we doing for time? I don't even.
You have a few minutes.
Okay, 3 more minutes. So that's it, which is why I asked. So perhaps we could have a bit of an open discussion on this topic. Anything come to mind that you'd like to share with the room? Yeah.
Sorry, Mark, a couple of things is on the maternal heart. On the maternal heart, I think one of the things that the Business Innovation Center is missing in terms of what it's kind of outlining as the foundational elements of the maternal heart. First off, I don't like the term soft skills, so I'll put that out there.
That's my turn.
That's just me. For me, those are the important skills. The rest are the technical skills as far as I'm concerned. So that's my first kind of bias. But what I would say there is what the maternal heart is speaking to, which is what is critical for innovation to take place, is the building of trust. So So they talk about all these other things. I think the element that's missing there is the element of trust. So that's one of the things I want to talk about. And I think the other thing is, when it comes to open data and open government and how this is going to be a way to get more citizen involvement, I think what happens is, once again, we go back into our silo thinking in a way. And this is just me, once again, not challenging you or anything you've said, but just our own thinking around this as we kind of get ready for this afternoon. And that is, how do we enable, the participation of folks in policy and program and service development? It's one thing to say that we're going to want to do that through providing all this access and being more inclusive. The next step is, well, how do you actually do that? How do we make this work? And so for this afternoon, we get into the conversations around not only the principles, but the how-to. That's fundamentally important because we have you guys doing all your great stuff at your end, but if all of your partners and all the other ministries are not kind of taking that and going, okay, well, how are we going to be more collaborative now? We've got to make this thing work for the citizens, not just for us in terms of designing nice systems.
So if I could add to that, the other thing I think was missing from the innovation slide was the idea of governance, and that we have to offer a path for innovative ideas to move forward and to be approved, and then to be standardized as they are approved and implemented. So I think governance is a key part of that. I agree, we need open government or any sort of change that supports inclusivity. Doesn't happen by itself. We have to get out there, we have to, the red part of the semicircle, remember there was the blue, the green, the red. The red part is around collaboration. If we don't change the model of collaboration, if we don't look horizontally, I don't think we'll be successful in the design of any sort of either open government or inclusive services. Okay, any other? Those are time. Yeah, comment over here.
It goes back to the point that you made earlier.
I think it goes back to the point that you made earlier about risk, being risk averse. If you're not going to kind of look at the possibilities of risks and go beyond those, you're going to make mistakes. But learning from those mistakes and building on those mistakes. But if you're always going to be hiding behind the risk factors, you're never going to move forward.
But then also, if it's not only, we've heard investing. It's not just the group that's doing the work that has to take on that risk, it also has to come from the executive management as well, being able to take that risk, and those above them as well, politicians. The other point I was thinking of as well is we're looking at right now for the My Alberta Digital ID service, the idea of digital assisted services. So this kind of goes to the idea that we're not going to have a silver bullet that solves every problem with a piece of technology. There's still going to have to be boots on the ground, whether those are private or public service based people who are able to go through and assist those people who have access problems to the technology.
And this isn't something that is generally our idea. We've been looking at what the United Kingdom has been doing with their digital assist programs. So they've acknowledged that 80-20 doesn't work, but they can't get their digital services to 100%. So what can they do to ensure that it is inclusive and covering that 20% that might not be covered digitally?
This is all great material for the second half of the day, I'm sure. So that's good. We'll be exploring that as we think about principles then and implementation. I think the idea of how do we include more in the design of our policy, more folks in the design of our policy or the design of our IT, our digital systems. How do we do that? Our project management processes haven't really allowed for inclusive stakeholder consultations. Even the word stakeholder isn't inclusive. It means that we're talking to those who are comfortable with the subject we're not talking about, but how do we reach out to those who are uncomfortable but still need to participate in government services? How do we do that? We design basically from 8:15 to 4:30. Not everyone's going to be available from 8:15 to 4:30. How can digital tools support us? so that we're able to bring in those who aren't available 8:15 to 4:30? How do we connect? It used to be that, I'm going to pick on the Queen's Printer for a second. So Giselle over there has the Queen's Printer. And as we were doing our consultations with respect to the distribution of our laws and through other means, Giselle did some pretty amazing work in reaching out across the province. She spoke in different locations. But we did reach a full audience. You may not agree, but we reached out to those who were typical users of the Queen's Printer. But what about those who are interested in our laws and regulations, who find it challenging to understand and to be able to collect those laws and regulations? What did we do to involve those people? And did our processes support that? So I would say that we did well, but we could have done more. We could have reached out. You can imagine the confusion that most people have understanding our laws and regulations. I have confusion in understanding those. What about the disadvantaged? What about the blind? What about the homeless? Don't they also deserve to be able to understand and participate in understanding our laws and regulations? We write them for all citizens, after all. So we've been ourselves, within the Queen's Printer, challenged to be able to figure that out. Okay, so.
Take one round.
One more question? Okay, one more.
I just have a comment. I'm possibly the only elected official in the room, so this really is an eye-opener for me. But what I find throughout a lot of my experience with government is that the only people you hear from are those who are dissatisfied. And in some ways, you almost need to express some, or develop a sense of exclusion in order to motivate the people who are excluded to be included. They won't stand up, they won't speak up, they won't speak out until they think that they're not being heard. I don't know how the heck you go about that.
It's about being inclusive. To those who love what we're doing and those who don't love what we're doing, I guess. Sorry, do you just identify yourself?
Well, I'm Art Harrison. I'm a councillor of the Village of Long.
Okay, thank you so much, and thanks for coming.
I'm also on the ACCB board of directors here with Bev Matthiessen.
Well, thanks, Mark. Great conversation to kick off the day and talk about demonstrating what an interesting challenge this is. I think Mark's given us some ideas on the direction that government is going in, some of the challenges we find ourselves in moving in that direction. And what we're here today to do is really open up this conversation, open up the dialogue about what we know and what we don't know, and maybe about what we assume. Nancy and I were talking earlier about assumptions, and I think she's going to challenge some of your assumptions. And I think this is actually going to be a fun conversation because it can do nothing but improve how we actually think about inclusivity. And when we talked on the phone the other day, to me, when I think about inclusive, I think about all sorts of groups who could be construed to be excluded, not just the disabled, although they're a more visible section of the excluded. Or not, absolutely. Or not, maybe not as obvious as we might think, but we have refugee populations, we have homeless populations, we have seniors, we have, did you see in that Wordle that there was a word spelled incorrectly? I thought it was really funny. The word illiterate was spelled incorrectly. I thought that was hysterical. Yay, talk about demonstrating. Anyway, we're going to have some great conversation this morning and this afternoon. Now we're going to take a 5-minute break, about a 5-minute break, and And I'm, as your lead facilitator, I'm sort of the timekeeper and the time manager and the wrangler of all of you. And I'm going to do a little wrangling right now and suggest as you go to get your coffee or juice or tea or whatever it is you're going to refresh yourself with shortly, that Nancy, who is sitting down here, will not be standing to make her presentation, nor does she have a PowerPoint. Recognizing that having been in presentations where the PowerPoints failed and everything ground to a halt, she's decided to rely on her brain rather than the PowerPoint, and good on you for that. But she's also not going to crick her neck looking behind herself. And because you didn't know when you sat down how this was going to work, I'm going to suggest to you there's an opportunity to foster the intimacy of this conversation by those of you who are sitting behind Nancy, occupying some of the front rows.
I look much better from the front. At least I think I do, anyway.
She's got really cool jewelry, and you can't see it from back there. I asked my folks to put together some do you knows, did you know? And here's a did you know that was interesting to me. Did you know that the Business Insider magazine named Christina Chen one of the most powerful women engineers in the world based on her advocacy of inclusive design at Microsoft? That's an interesting thing to know. People are working in this area. However, we have lots of ground to make up, I think, and Nancy and I just had a conversation. I think you're going to enjoy her presentation, and she's going to challenge your thinking. And bearing in mind what Mark's talked about and the thoughts that have come into your mind as we've talked about where government is and what it's trying to do about opening up for all citizens, we're going to delve into a discussion more focused on people with disabilities and the particular struggles they face in accessing digital services. So Nancy's here from the University of Manitoba. She's going to help us consider some of these questions. What do assumptions made through the design of self-service of government services say about the place of disabled people in Canadian society? You want to read it? That's a double-barreled question. Let me read it again so you can think about it. What do assumptions made through the design of self-service delivery of government services say about the place of disabled people in Canadian society? Where can governments improve delivery of service to disabled persons? Where have there been some successes? And perhaps where have there been some failures? I think you'll have the opportunity to join in and comment and ask questions. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation, and I don't think Nancy is a congenial person, but I don't think she's going to cut us any slack. So I think we're going to enjoy this quite a bit. So I'll turn the time to Nancy.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. And I think I feel very honored to be here. And hopefully I can bring you some information that you might not readily be aware of, okay? And I'm just hoping to let you think about things and go, So maybe you might not all agree with me, but at least it'll start you thinking. And that's my job here, is to get people thinking critically and just to recognize that things simply aren't the way they are just because. They're the way they are because of certain assumptions, certain ways of thinking, and certain ways of being in a culture, right? First of all, isn't it interesting how we see that knowledge comes from a standing position, right? There's an assumption that valued knowledge comes from a standing position, yet I've never given a standing up lecture in my entire life. Okay, is that better? Okay, so as I was saying, that knowledge comes from a standing position, and that knowledge is given out in a particular way. First of all, okay, I thought how many people here have had any exposure to disability? Anything at all? Okay, that's good. Okay, you're not going to get tested on this, at least as far as I know, but what does the term disability mean? Okay? And don't worry about terminology, I don't care, This is about communication, right? So don't worry about terminology. There's no such thing as incorrect terminology. So what is disability? If somebody doesn't stick up their hand, I'll pick some. Okay.
So I guess perhaps maybe physical or cognitive impairments.
Right.
That might, I don't know, limit someone. Yeah,
That's good. That's good. A good Western approach to the whole concept of disability. No, that's fine. That's fine. I'm glad that all this stuff gets absorbed so well, you know? Anybody else? Anybody else? That was great, by the way. Anybody else? Okay. How we see disability is very much culturally imbued, right? In Western culture, disability is seen as a very negative thing, a very limiting thing. It's described in terms of what people can't do, or something that needs to be corrected or eliminated, right? But the truth is, disability has always been present. It's always been a natural part of the human condition. And the reality is, unlike myself and Harry and George here, they've been my own private menage a trois my entire life. Most people think that disability comes with hardware. But the reality is, most disability is invisible, and you'd never know that individual had a disability unless they self-identify. And chances are they won't, because disability, for some reason I cannot understand, is not perceived as sexy. Right? I don't get that. I've always been proud to be a four-legged woman, but hey, I come from I've always had a disability. I've always been proud to be who I am, and I'm white. I come from an upper middle class family, and I'm able to manage in environments where nobody expects me to be in the first place. Because one interesting thing about disability, it's always a surprise when you show up. I don't know where we're supposed to be, but we're never supposed to be where we are. So people tend to freak out, okay? They're afraid of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, or, you know, just so they don't say anything. Or they make assumptions around what disability is, or more importantly, what it isn't, right? And most of what is known about disability, and I put known in quotation marks here, has been provided by non-disabled people. So what we know about disability isn't really known, it's what we assume, and one should never make assumptions, right? So, here we go. Is this making sense so far? Okay. Okay, there are 1 billion, that's billion with a B, disabled people in the world, right? That's a lot of people. So I think it's 1 in 5 in Alberta, right? That's a lot of people too. And we have some interesting statistics. We are among the most technologically, educationally, and employment disadvantaged minorities in the world, right? We're one of the biggest, yet we're one of the most disadvantaged. And a disabled person isn't simply a disabled person, right? Although we like to think of disabled people as genderless and sexless, that's not the case, okay? Because gender cuts across, disability cuts across gender, income, racialized groups, everything. So it's not, it doesn't exclude any particular group. But we tend to think of disabled people as this small group because we've been in a world where nobody expects us to be. We weren't expected to go to school. We weren't expected to have jobs. We weren't expected to have employment. We weren't expected to live, at least in a Western context, anywhere outside of an institution. And for example, I'll use myself as an example because I'm the disabled person I know best. In my lifetime, depending on where I was in Canada, I could have been sterilized. I wasn't, but I could have been. In my lifetime, I was not allowed to go to public school, right? Because up until recently, public schools were excluding people with disabilities. That's just to give you an idea of why it's so important to have inclusivity now and why it's important to change ways of thinking. So employment, housing, transportation, and schooling were off limits for a lot of people with disabilities. We've been caught up in a sort of a lack of expectation. To paraphrase Stella, whose last name I can't remember, she's an Australian disability activist. She says, people think it's amazing if I get out of bed in the morning and remember my own name. So hopefully we're going to move the bar up a little bit farther. That's why it's important to have all you in the room here, because we have nowhere to go but forward, right? And the fact that you're going to make the web environment more accessible for disabled people opens up a whole realm of possibility. And what I want you to think of is possibility as opposed to what's not possible. Because we live in a world of body privilege, right? We privilege certain ways of being, certain ways of thinking, and certain ways of doing, right? We're all supposed to move in a certain way, think in a certain way, and process the world in a certain way. And those assumptions we make about people have real impact on disabled people's lives. Okay. So what we want to do is kind of change assumptions, right? And I think not to be negative or anything, but I think we have to sort of move beyond the kind of ideas that are very well intentioned. I mean, it's a starting point. But the CRIP for a day approach to understanding what it's like to live with a disability, right? Because we are the most creative people you're ever going to meet out of necessity, because we have to work around an environment that never expects us to be there in the first place. So I think that, and we have to stop seeing disability as necessarily a negative thing. It's just different. I mean, there are some negative elements. There can be negative elements associated with disability, but that doesn't mean that it's all negative all the time. But the way our culture has been exposed to disability, one can understand why that's the possible understanding of what disability is. Okay. Poverty, aging, and disaster are the most common causes of disability, right? So I thought the best way of figuring out why we are in the place we are at the moment is just to go over some basic information. There's a lot of negative attitudes around disability. Can anybody name some negative attitudes around disability? Why are we? Don't be shy. I know what they are, but I want to hear what you think they are. And don't worry, I'm not gonna get upset or anything, because trust me, I've heard this stuff before. Yes?
Well, I think often an attitude is around the assumption that there's going to be like up or down or not enough values added.
Yes.
That someone on our team or someone part of finding a solution who may have a disability may slow us down, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's good. Okay. What else? Yes.
Can be a presumption of irrationality.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
I think the biggest thing is fear of the unknown. So
yeah.
No limited knowledge or no knowledge of what the condition is,
yes.
what the capabilities are, what the limitations are, and so it really fits into that whole fear.
Yeah.
On how to interact, what to interact with, what does that look like?
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest thing is the assumptions around what is the condition.
Okay, so, yes.
So you're going to cost us more money. We're going to have to design functions with extra features. We're going to have to spend more time in design of websites.
Yeah.
It's going to, in these days of fiscal restraint, you're awfully expensive.
Access is always framed around cost. That's the big thing. But the reality is, if you build it in to start with, you add about 1 to 2% in your overall cost run. And what's important to recognize too is that things that we see as a natural part of doing business are not seen as cost elements. They're seen as what we need to do to get the job done, right? Like, for a meeting, for example, everybody gets coffee and you know, because that's the way we do business. That's an overly simplified way of doing things, right? And it's amazing how many people are afraid to have a conversation, to start with, to ask questions, because people are afraid of the unknown, but familiarity breeds understanding. And the reality is, if we make the environment more accessible for those who are labeled as disabled, the environment is actually better for everybody. So what are some of those other things that kind of make people dubious of disability?
If you can't see it, it's not real.
Oh, that's right. If you can't see it, it's not. And the most disability is invisible, right? I mean, yes.
I think sometimes we're afraid of our own incapacity to engage. It's our own disability that is a limiter for us, because we're afraid of making a mistake, doing something offensive or hurtful.
That's okay. I think the fact that we're all sitting here in a room, and I'm on this side of the desk, for one thing, is like really cool. Not that I'm a megalomaniac or anything, but it's really cool for a disabled person to be in a position of power and information sharing, because often disabled people are being told what they should do and how they should do it and what would work best for them. And it's very important to recognize that valued knowledge comes from all parts of the community, and that means whatever type of disadvantage we're talking about, or perceived disadvantage. I like to think of it as sort of different ways of being. Okay? And one thing I forgot to mention, that disability and impairment among First Nations populations is far, far higher than it is amongst the non-Indigenous population. So it's much, much higher. And when you consider that is First Nation population make about 2% of the Canadian population in general, that's a very interesting statistic. That's something we have to consider. So I think we have to start having a conversation and not being afraid about what we're saying or how we say it. The conversation is going to get things started. So I give you some examples of what happens to me or to people that I know on a regular basis, right? Dealing with technology and how technology is changing. And for disabled people, there is a digital divide that's developing, right? Coming into the airport yesterday, I use the airport wheelchair for speed and timing. And the person who was pushing me, she said, "What are you here for?" And I said, I'm going to give a presentation on making the web more accessible to people with disabilities. She said, "That's cool, that's really cool, because I used to work with people with autism, and they use the web all the time because they can network and engage with people without being near in physical proximity to people because it makes them nervous." And she said sometimes the timing of websites is very frustrating for people with autism because it takes them that much longer to process what's there, and often the speed and timing of what required for web access doesn't mesh with their speed and timing. Welcome to my life. My speed and timing is chronically different than the average person. And she also said to me, she said, by the way, I'm dyslexic, so you know those mechanisms that determine whether a person is a robot or not, the ones that mesh figures with numbers. She says, I can't use them because I can't read them. So just imagine how many websites are out there with those kind of mechanisms that are completely impossible for people to use, right? And I can't use them either because they often time out too quickly. I type at a whopping 10 words a minute. Regardless of how much practicing I do, it's going to be 10 words a minute, right? So those, and because I'm an academic, I have to use SHRC to apply for awards and grants and whatever. I don't, because I can't use SHRC because physically it's far too difficult for me to do it. Because in my experience, it may be different for other people, but in my experience, the website itself is always timing out, and I can't save the information, so I have to start from scratch. Okay? That's my experience. Maybe it's because I'm not technologically inclined, but that's my experience. And having to type as much information over and over and over again, it's not the best use of my time. Because speed, space, and time as a disabled person, it takes a lot of work to make it look seamless. And I'm not saying, oh, please, isn't it awful that I'm a disabled person? No, it isn't. What's interesting is that there are certain assumptions around the time, speed, and the way that things are done. And that there's only one way of doing things. And I'm sitting here in a room full of really creative people, and I hope your thought mechanisms are moving in different directions, because it's going to change lives for a lot of people. My secretary, for example, is completely blind. She's the most tech-savvy individual I know. But people are always sending her PDFs with images, right? And she has screen reading software. And if you provide images without alt tags in them, all it says is image. It doesn't tell you what is contained within that image, right? So simple things can make a big, big difference. And even things like accessing a washing machine or accessing dishwashers now, since there's no dials to turn, a lot of it is based on visual comprehension of, like, I'm not using the correct words. My vocabulary is escaping me. But you know when there's a visual mode to look at, to pick your icon. Thank you very much, an icon. That's totally useless for her, right? And she is articulate, intelligent, but she can't use a lot of the stuff that's out there now because it relies on pictographs, right? And the more and more we move toward that way of thinking, it excludes more and more people. What's important to recognize too is levels of literacy are very different depending on what segment of the population you're dealing with too, right? We can't assume that everybody's familiar with jargon. If you come from a different culture where English is not, or French is not your first language, or if you're deaf, for example, where you rely on ASL or you rely on captioned websites. A lot of websites aren't captioned for instruction, for example. There is some captioning on YouTube, for example, but a lot of that captioning that's in there bears no relation to what's actually being said when you check. I'm always checking things like that out. Is this okay so far? it's just simple things, but simple things can make a big difference. And just because it has to do with disability doesn't mean it has to be complicated. It's just a different way of thinking, right? And people, we've always you know, you have to embrace your discomfort level or your individual yuck factor, right, around disability, and recognize it's okay to feel yucky, but get over it, because everybody's going to win out of this deal, right? Especially since Canada has signed the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, right? Which we've signed off on. So it gives the disability community something to lean on. It's not necessarily binding, but it is something to work with. And it's one of the best pieces of legislation that I've ever seen dealing around with disability issues. And you know why that is? It's because disabled people were involved from the outset, right? Rather than making assumptions and not have, moving beyond sort of tokenism. And that's, I mean, I know it's not meant to be tokenistic, but in many ways it is. I think what one has to do is assume that disability is always present, right? Not that you're designing period, and disabled people are always part of that equation, whether or not you are aware that they're there or not, right? Because a lot of disabled people do not have access to the most up-to-date computers or computer software, if they have computers at all, right? Many people, when they finish school, for example, they lose access to computer systems, right? Because of funding. A lot of software that makes things accessible is very, very expensive, so most people with disabilities can't afford it. Okay. I didn't know if there was a question. Oh, you're just scratching your head. It's okay. I just didn't know if there was a question back there or what. So is there any more questions so far? Because I'm tired of hearing my own voice. So are there any? Yes?
Maybe just a comment, Nancy.
Yeah.
So I want to challenge. There's the challenging of the convention in terms of challenging assumptions. So I'm going to challenge your assumption.
Okay, sure.
And so one of the things I heard you say was, for instance, you can type 10 words a minute.
Yeah.
Now, I would challenge your assumptions two ways. One is, what about Dragon software, which is voice recognition software?
Yes.
And the other assumption I would challenge is, in universities more and more, the Aboriginal community comes from an oral culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're getting universities that are opening up to, well, rather than a typed, 300-page thesis for a doctoral submission, there's other ways that they can actually access that kind of higher education through the use of videos and things like that. So I guess one of the things that I heard you say about, shirk and the application and the timing out and everything else, I wonder if you're actually challenging the system by potentially putting forward a shirk application that's a video rather than a typed application. I don't know.
It's an interesting possibility. I'm not saying no to it. But as far as drag and dictate goes, it's incredibly expensive. And also, for those of us, for people with speech disabilities, right? And sometimes with speech disabilities, there are also coordination differences too. Drag and dictate may not necessarily like your specific accent, right? If you have an accent that's difficult to place, or as those of you might call it, some sort of speech impediment. I'm not trying to make things more, I'm not trying to challenge you either. I'm just trying to say that things aren't as necessarily as straightforward. And even though universities may be open to more oral elements, at least in my own university, there's more and more. To do your initial application, for example, it's not paper-based anymore. It's on all of it's on the web, and all of it. You have to be able to scan material, and it can cause difficulties in doing so. And it presumes that you have access to the equipment to do it in the first place. Yes?
I think we've all seen and had a little chuckle at the thing on Facebook about Jim Scott and the voice actor in the elevator.
Yes. Yes.
Is that for someone in the chair who's having difficulty speaking?
It just makes people think that there may be more than one way of doing something, and we can't value that way of doing something over something else. We have to be open. If we're going to be open and inclusive, then we have to be open and inclusive all the time, not when it's convenient, right? And not make the assumption that it's going to take more time. It just is what it is, right? Yes?
I'm wondering if part of the assumption includes the definition itself of disability, because it's a very broad definition.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of, we throw out, and we tend to throw out different solutions, which one may work for people who are blind, one may work for people who are dyslexic, and so on. And part of the assumption is that we're trying to come up with a solution, and that's where I think the challenge is, that meets that whole broad definition of everybody that falls into what we think is disability.
Yeah. I think it's important to maybe not ask what the condition is or what the impairment is. What do you need to solve the issue that you're dealing with? How you got there is not necessarily, I have cerebral palsy, right? But I don't care about having cerebral palsy. What I need is this, this, and this. You don't necessarily need to know what the disability is to solve the problem, right? Right? And what does that do? I understand that there are certain parameters that you need to know about, but what it should be is looking at how does one deal with this particular situation, as opposed to what does that individual have, There was a question back there, yeah?
One of the things I just wanted you to just think about, or let me know if you thought about it, is the generational difference. I would like to hope that our students that are just coming out of maybe grade 12, maybe currently in high school, have benefited from being with people with a range of abilities. Our inclusive education approach in Alberta has kind of gained traction over the last 10 years. Do you know of any evidence that, like, once those kids graduated and are in sort of the workforce, you refer to the individual young factor?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's some hope in that group of, just now graduating.
Okay, yes, there are some positive elements there, right? Okay, but a lot of the support programs and services leave as soon as one hits higher education, right? So that's problematic, right? And then also we have to get around employer perceptions around what disability is, or how problematic it is, or capacity of the individual, right? So we have to deal with a lot of mythology around disability.
Yeah,
too.
absolutely. And for one of the other side of the factor is the students who had the privilege of going to school with another student with a disability. I think that they have benefited, and I'm hoping that they will be the ones that will champion and become more, like, it's not going to have to be something that's turned to and policy, oh yeah, I need to think about this group, but it will just be more.
Like I say, it should be a natural part of doing business, wherever you are, a natural part of doing business, right? I mean, and everybody benefits, right? Everybody benefits, especially as the population ages. And now I'm an aging person with a disability, and I hit 3. I'm a bilingual, aging, disabled woman. There you go, So we're all, not that it's a contest, but we're all going to get there. So think of this as forward planning. Okay? This is a forward planning exercise. So what you do now is going to improve things for you later. Not that I'm advocating that you're going to go out and get hit by a bus, but disability is a natural part of the aging process. And it is natural. And if we recognize that disability is natural, then it takes some of the unease or dis-ease out of it. And just as you would design code for certain things, you design for disability. And rather than, like, this is why having this conversation is so important. Just to recognize that disability is not something to be afraid of. I realize that there are cost elements involved, but benefits everybody, right? The more barriers you can break down in whatever fashion, the better off everybody's going to be, right? It's cost effective in the long run. I know that sounds like a Hallmark card, but it's true. It's absolutely true. Yes?
So I know of at least one instance where a developer created a website that tried to emulate what it was like to have a disability. In this instance, it was what it was like to be dyslexic, and the words were moving around and things like that. Do you think technologies like that are effective in kind of educating people or getting them to shift their perspective to see what that's like?
They may be one, how shall we say, one tool in the toolbox, right? But I think if we try and oversimplify things, it's like it's like treating racialized issues like if you just put some black tint on your face, you'll understand what it's like to be a person of color. That's not it. That's not it at all. But the fact that we're here having the conversation, it's one part, it's one element for your toolbox. It can be a tool, but it shouldn't be the first thing that you go to. And I didn't mean to be disrespectful of anybody. I just want people to understand it's more layered than people often assume that it is, but it shouldn't be scary either. Yes?
So I know that a lot of work has been done in the last few years in relation to seniors and web design and taking into account some of the physiological side effects of vision as you age and things like that.
Yep.
So do you think that I guess it's just your opinion, do you think that there has been work done in that area for persons with disabilities and it just hasn't been acknowledged, or do you think it's a gap?
It's a very interesting question that you pose because the aging community doesn't like to identify as disabled, and the disability community doesn't necessarily see themselves as aging. But you know what there's ageism and ableism in both. We're not immune from the cultures that we grow up in, right? But if we can look at commonalities as opposed to we can pool resources, right? Yes.
So I guess you're suggesting a more intersectional.
Yes, definitely. Intersectionality is the way to go, right? Definitely, because we've been siloing things for far too long. And everybody brings something to the party, right? Everybody brings something to the table. And if we look at them as assets as opposed to deficits, we can bring knowledge from whatever part of the intersectional place we find ourselves in. We can all bring something, right? That's what's important.
Nancy, I have a question. When we talk about moving into this digital environment, and I think the conversation is wonderful, but frequently what happens is we take a non-digital process and move it into a digital environment.
Yeah.
Assuming that the non-digital process is perfect. And so now we make it in a digital environment, and now it's got to even be more perfect.
Yeah.
And I think we all know that that's not the case. The same prejudices or assumptions, as a milder word, that inform our challenges in the digital environment informed our other processes as well. Are there places that you've experienced that have actually been more successful in taking a service delivery process that was non-digital and putting it into the digital world and really turning it upside down so that it actually works for you?
Okay, a really basic thing, okay? I no longer have to use a key when I go into a hotel room. I can just take a plastic card and move it. It requires less coordination to do that, right? Or there are other places, depending, now there's a caveat attached to this. If I have to wave a card, it's fine, providing I'm not opening a door at the same time. But card waving is great, as long as I don't have to do anything with my other hand, because if I'm doing something with my other hand while I'm waving the card, I'm falling down. You know, and other things like going through customs now. I do a lot of international travel, and in a lot of border sites, in like Toronto and Montreal, for example, when you're coming back from overseas, your passport gets scanned, so you don't have to fill out a lot of information like you used to. Things like I've been going to university at various points in my life. When I first started out, right, I didn't have a computer. Right? Back in the Stone Ages, I barely gotten rid of my stone tablet or whatever. But the biggest change in my life when I was going to university is the delete key on a computer, because I didn't have to get out the, now for those of you under 40, you won't know what I'm talking about, but there are, okay, I won't have to take out my little brush and make white marks or go back and take a piece of tape and go over it. So a delete key changed my life as a student. And I'm not being facetious, it honestly did, right? And the fact that I can cut and paste information has changed my life as well, right? So that's a really positive thing. It's the simple things, like, I don't use a wireless mouse because I knock things on the floor. So having a mouse with a cord is great. So I'm not under the table trying to find a mouse. And I have, for myself, I have difficulty with the trackpad. I don't know if I'm using the right terminology, but it's difficult for me. My husband, who also has CP, and that's not the reason I married him. I married him because he was dead sexy. But he has a master's in computer science, right? So but he's now a criminal lawyer. So I don't know. Anyway, but what I'm trying to say is he uses a trackpad all the time because he thinks it's fantastic, right? So I think it's being able to build in as much as you can so it doesn't exclude people, right? And I'm not I'm not the spokesperson for the entire disability community, but what I'm here to do is like sort of get you thinking in another direction and thinking that things that they can work in both. By the way, as a person teaching in university, we've switched all our travel documents to online input. What used to take me a couple of hours to do, last time I did it took 5 days. I've now turned it over to my office assistant, Tanis, who's the tech-savvy wizard, who's blind. She is an absolute wizard at this stuff because her coordination is better than mine, right? And so she does all my travel documents, and it takes like a couple of hours, which is less than it's taken a lot of other non-disabled people on campus to do the same thing, right? So what I'm saying, again, we all bring something to the table and we all find workarounds to make these digital elements work. Because digital stuff is a great thing. Digital stuff is changing people's lives. It's enabling people to access places that aren't accessible physically. They can access them digitally. So, I mean, it opens up so much for disabled people, but we have to look at what's the thinking process that goes in the first place? How have we covered off everything? No, people can't cover off everything, but it's important that we at least start thinking about it, and this is what's important about today, is that we're thinking about it. Any questions? Because I think I'm just about out of my time. Am I?
You're right, edging up.
Okay. Any questions? Are you dazed? Oh, yes. I'm
So,
confused.
if I'm hearing this correctly, you're kind of opening up the discussion in terms of having a broad user group,
Yeah.
looking at developing as opposed to looking at the disability itself.
Yeah.
Because to your point, you know, you use the example of not having a wireless mouse, but you know, someone with the same disability may like to have.
Exactly.
So don't focus on the disability itself, but have a wide, vast
Exactly.
user group when we're looking at developing.
Exactly. I mean, you people are all creative. So why do you want to think in a very linear way? Think in as creatively as you possibly can, because you'll change people's lives by doing that. And I know that sounds really corny, but it's true. You can help people access the community that have never been able to access it before. And that's pivotal. You can facilitate independence through interdependence, because we're all interdependent. And we're losing so much creativity by excluding entire groups of people, be they disabled, be they from different cultural groups, different, genders, sexual orientation. All of that stuff brings something to the party, right? And it's going to be a richer society because of it. I know I sound like a Hallmark card, but I honestly believe it. I truly do. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here. I really appreciate it.
Well, hello everybody, and I'd like to start by saying thank you very much for inviting us here today. We're very excited about this opportunity, and this is the first for us. I don't think we've ever talked about the new digital world that we're all moving into and how it impacts people with disabilities. So I'll just tell you to begin with that I've got so much swirling around in my head. I hope that I'm able to organize it as I talk because of all the things that have come before and some of the things that Nancy said. And we are from a small organization, Alberta Community of Citizens with Disabilities, is known by ACCP. And so I'll tell you a little bit about our organization, and then I'm going to go into some legislation. So who is ACCP? So we are a cross-disability, meaning we speak on behalf of people with developmental, mental health, physical, sensory, which is deaf and hard of hearing, blind and visually impaired, and also people with progressive disabilities. And what our main job is to impact legislation. So we've been pretty successful at that at ACCB through the years. We were instrumental in starting AISH many years ago. We were instrumental in getting that $400 a month increase on April 1st, 2012. The Home Adaptation Program, Alberta Aid State Aid Living, and a lot of other programs and services. So our organization is run and managed by people with disabilities. And Mark said that his boss was in the room there today, and so one of my bosses is in the room, and his name is Art. And he's one of 10 bosses. There's 9 more coming from all over the province, so that's how we get to be provincial. And we're cross-disability, and we consider ourselves to be the voice of people with disabilities in Alberta. Not of a parent, not of the non-disabled person, but the person with a disability. And that's a very important distinction. And And that's why Art quickly pointed out, we're not for, we're of. So we are the people with disabilities in Alberta. At least we think we are anyway. And I do want to just clarify that I couldn't possibly be speaking on behalf of everybody, in Alberta who has a disability here today. But generally, we feel that we can do that. And we were incorporated in 1973. So we've been around over 40 years, and we're a very small grassroots organization. So we have 5 main programs that we provide. One of them is education and awareness. So we are on a weekly basis going out talking to people, raising awareness about people with disabilities. We speak to literally thousands of students every year, even from, lately we've been talking to kindergarten. So we have a book that we read that's appropriate for 4 and 5-year-olds, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, and then we do a lot of work in universities, post-secondary, K to 12, and just going in there, getting them to think about disabilities, what's the proper way to speak about people with disabilities, what are some of the issues that people with disabilities have. And so just to put it right where it is, we will go out and speak to almost everyone who invites us, and that means 10 minutes to full days. We do workshops on duty to accommodate and that sort of thing. We do a lot of projects and research, and one of the ones that I want to mention here today is our barrier-free health and medical services. So personally, I've been working for 8 years now, trying to bring awareness about the inaccessibility of preventative health and medical services for people with disabilities. So what this means is, can a person with a physical disability get into an examining room in a physician's office? Can they get up on the table to have an annual physical? Can they get an MRI, a CT scan, a bone scan, a prostate exam, a mammogram? The answer is no. Those services are not accessible to people with disabilities, not just physical disabilities, other kinds of disabilities too, such as people with communication disabilities, visually impaired, and so on. So even our medical programs, services aren't accessible to people with disabilities. And we just finished another project which was dental, eye care, and pharmacies. And they're not accessible either, because how do you get into that dentist chair to get your teeth fixed? And sometimes it's almost impossible. And in some rural areas, the reason we started on this in the first place was a fellow had his annual physical in his van because the physician's office wasn't accessible. And people look at me and say, well, I thought that was all looked after. I thought people with disabilities would be able to access healthcare services. And the answer is no, really, they can't access it. So we've been working for 7, 8, 9 years now doing research projects, trying to bring awareness around that. And we've been trying to impact the building code, and that's a whole other issue, because moving the building code to get something included in it is almost impossible. So we're going to talk about accessibility legislation in a minute, and I'll tell you a little bit about what's being done elsewhere. Collaborations and partnerships. We started the Alberta Disabilities Forum, and that's over 40 disability organizations that have come together to have a united voice on disability issues. And so that's the only group like that across Canada. And we've been extremely successful in working on about 3 major issues per year. And then we develop position papers. We take it to our elected officials, our public servants, the business community, the general public, anywhere we can to raise awareness about it. Our latest meeting that we had with the Alberta Disabilities Forum was on physician-assisted dying and how that's going to affect people with disabilities. And so we had a really good discussion with a human rights lawyer, and also with a palliative care doctor came and talked to us. And what we did was put together some criteria that must be put into legislation in June 6th. That's going to happen in Canada. It's going to happen all across Canada. And how do people with disabilities who are very vulnerable be protected? And so we did put together some criteria around that, because it's very threatening, of course, to someone who is vulnerable and disadvantaged. our support and referral. We have people in our office every day helping them fill out forms, because those are those people that can't access some of the digital ways of accessing programs. So they come into our office and we help them fill out the forms or do whatever it is they have to do. A lot of it has to do with AISH, and I know AISH isn't online, but there's housing and a lot of other things. So we clarify it. Make sure it's completely filled out. We make sure that all the documents are there. We photocopy it and we put it in the mail so that they can have some assistance with that, because we're finding that it's just too complicated and they can't do it. So we have at least 2 people come in for an hour to an hour and a half on a daily basis, just helping them navigate some of the paperwork that needs to be done to be able to access some of the government programs. So there should tell you something right there about what we're talking about today. And then we have some bursaries and awards. We're extremely proud of this. We give about $5,000 away every year to post-secondary students. Generally, we like to help them when they're just starting out, and it gives them a chance to get some education. And we do have some people that donate specifically to that program, and I have a dream of making it a lot more than $5,000, because there's so many students that would really be able to use the help. So that's a little bit about our organization. So I just want to talk a little bit. I think this has pretty much already been covered, but it's the population with a disability by region across Canada. I see that somehow or other this slide presentation is moving around a little bit, but it's pretty clear anyway. So in Canada, and this is 2012 StatsCan, so there's 13.7% of the population, which is 3.8 million people, and in Alberta 12.5, which is 503,000, and that's not including seniors. And so seniors would like to, as Nancy said, consider themselves to have disabilities, and the disability community doesn't want to be hanging around seniors either. So there's probably another 500,000 people in Alberta who are seniors. And so that's a lot of people. So when we take this out and talk to students, what we say is, do you think in the future you're going to be running across people when you are in post-secondary with disabilities? Because that's a lot of people, isn't it? And what about when you get into a job someday? You're going to be working with people with disabilities in that job, because there's a lot of people with disabilities. So we need to have some knowledge about people with disabilities, which would make it easier and better for us all in the long run. So if I were to just ask you, what are some barriers that people with disabilities face? Just shout some out. I think you've already probably know most of them, but let's kind of review them anyway.
Job opportunities.
Employment, absolutely. Mobility, that's a big one.
Physical barriers.
Physical barriers, that's a big one.
Financial.
Financial, huge.
Social.
Social, yes, that's a big part of us, isn't it? Social. So we just happen to have them broken down. All those are all included in these 4 different ways that when we go and do our presentations, we divide it into these 4 different areas. So, no barriers, that's one. Another one is environmental. Another one is communication, which is what we're talking about here today with digital, and the other one is transportation. Just about all the things that you told me there when I asked you can fit into these 4 areas. So let's just kind of talk about them for a minute. So a lot of the people that I know that have disabilities, if I said to them, what's your greatest barrier that you would face? And they would say attitudinal barriers of other people. That's what holds me back the most. The misperceptions, the myths that people believe about people with disabilities really holds me back, and that has to do with the education I get right from very young. It has to do with employment that I might get into, if I'm lucky enough to get a job, and it has to do with friends and social, family members and everything else. There's already an opinion there of me before they see me, and so that's if I have a visual disability, and as Nancy said, if it isn't visual, they sure aren't going to tell you, because they will, they'll pay for that in the way that we get treated. And so attitudinal barriers are the barriers that are the worst, and so that's why ACCD is going around doing the education and awareness that we do. Environmental barriers, those are the ones, the mobility, trying to get around the built environment. And that can be a huge barrier because our building code came in 2006 and it gets reviewed every 5 years. And the last review they did, which was just last year, they improved the 3.8 barrier per section of the Alberta building code. They widened doorways a little bit and they put it so that the signs for handicap parking now have to be visual above the ground instead of just the blue wheelchair on the ground. So that's all they did in 5 years. That was a change that they made. So if we live long enough, maybe they'll get some of our medical services put into the code. But that would be really huge to get done because it's very complex. There's a lot of people on the other side, like for instance the Medical Association, Alberta Health Services, Alberta Health, and so on, that would have to adjust and make changes there. So environmental barriers are all those barriers that in the physical environment that hold people with disabilities back. Transportation barriers, let's face it, DATS doesn't run like a bus. So you can't go down to the corner and hop on DATS. I think you have to make your reservation a couple days in advance to be able to get DATS, and then there's this wait before for them to come, and there's I think 45 minutes or so wait afterwards. You see people sitting there waiting for their transportation to come. It's a barrier because if I said to one of the people that used to be on our board, let's go out for dinner tonight, that she would have to say, well, where would we be going and how would I get there? Because I don't have transportation unless I order a cab, and that's very expensive. And then where would we be going in the built environment? Because is the washroom accessible? Because it doesn't have to be. Because that's not in the code. If the building was built before 2006, if it's not a major rental or a new building, it doesn't have to meet the code. And you see that I left communication barriers to the end because that is another huge, huge barrier for people with disabilities. I guess everything that we do is, communicating is a really, really, really big part of who we are as human beings, connecting with other people in so many different ways that we can do that. And if that's cut off to you, that means that a huge chunk of your life just isn't there anymore. And I always think about people who have a hearing impairment and they're in a care facility, probably a senior, and their hearing aids aren't working. I mean, you know the thousands of people that are in care facilities whose hearing aids don't have batteries and they're in the drawer. And they're completely isolated because there's no way for them to talk or to communicate with people because that is not something that care facilities consider to be their issue. They don't have to do that. So some of the organizations go around and help people. So, and then there's specific disabilities where you might have a computer system to help you speak and so on. So those are the 4 main barriers. So now what I did was I just kind of broke this up a bit and took those barriers and just wanted to just quickly go down. So transportation, obviously, we probably all know that. That's a bus, a car, trains, planes, and taxis. That's trying to get around the environment. Of course, it's worse in winter in Edmonton. Trying to even get to the bus, trying to even get to the taxi, the car, the train, the plane, and so on. Environmental barriers are doorways, ramps, steps, doors, and washrooms, and those aren't only for people with physical disabilities. They can be for people with visual disabilities. If there is around a door, there's a contrasting paint that can make it a lot easier for people to get through the door. It's not just people with physical disabilities, because that's what we tend to think of a lot of the time, just physical disabilities, but there are many other kinds of disabilities where the built environment hampers them from getting around. I've already talked about attitudinal barriers, and I thought it was really interesting that Nancy said familiarity breeds understanding. That's what she said, and I believe that to be very true. And so a lot of people are just uneducated about people with disabilities, and they have a lot of myths that they believe. Things like you can catch, like in the kids, when we go to talk to the kids in school, they say, "Can you catch schizophrenia?" And they'd say yes. So you better be careful of that person who has schizophrenia, because that would be something that you might be able to catch from them. So lots and lots of things like that are discrimination. Of course, we see that in employment. If someone comes in with a disability, what are their chances of getting that job? And then we have workshops at ACCD that say, when do you disclose you have your disability? Is it in your resume when you send it in? Because will you even be considered? Or when they phone you up and say, would you please come in for an interview? Do you tell them, I have a disability, will you be able to accommodate my disability when I come in? Because then already there's something happening there. Or do you just show up? So that's a big deal for the first person with a disability looking for employment. When do you disclose that you have the disability? And then fear. We talked already a little bit here about fear. And you know, I have a friend, her name's Anne, and we have an open house at ACCD every year, and I say, come on to the open house, Anne. It's really fun. She said, oh, Bev, I could never be around all those people with disabilities. And I'm just looking at her thinking, really? I mean, and she is older than me, so it's hopefully I don't find that young people they're more used to being around people with disabilities in school and that, but that's definitely out there. That fear, not knowing what to do, not knowing what to say. And then, of course, communication barriers are computers, equipment, braille, interpreters, and language. And so language is a really big one. I want to talk about that for just a moment, because I did send around a sheet about language. So what we're trying to do is teach the kids the proper language. So the proper language is to say a person who uses a wheelchair, a person who has cerebral palsy, a person who has a mental health disability. And there's a lot of words in there that we don't want people to use. One of them is crippled. Another one is retarded. And we don't want people to say physically challenged. We don't want people to say they're suffering from MS. We don't want people to say they're confined to a wheelchair. Because those are all judgments in your language before you're even, you're talking about the person, you've already got a judgment about them, that they're confined, they're suffering, all those kinds of things. They're a person first and the disability second. And that's the kind of language that we should be using when we're talking about disabilities. And so that's why I sent that around, just to maybe clear some things up for some people, because we don't know what to say. And then it changes too, doesn't it? What was appropriate maybe 5 years ago isn't appropriate anymore. So language is big. And I do always tell the kids, where does your language come from? Your language, what comes out your mouth, your language comes from your beliefs, your values, your thoughts. And that's what comes out of your mouth, right? That's what you think. So if you're using that improper kind of language, then that tells a lot about you. Whatever you're saying, that can tell a lot about what you're thinking and what your values and beliefs are. So that's why we think language is important. So the consequences of not being able to have all of those, or have those barriers being there, I guess I've already talked a lot about them already, but one of them would be lack of education. So just to back up a bit, our organization, one of our principles is full participation in society. And full participation, people say, what does that mean? That's just kind of lingo from the disability community. What does it really mean? Well, just to give an example, full participation as an example, would be that you can get an education, and then you can get a job, and you can live independently in the community. That would be a good example of full participation. And you, however, you might need some supports to be able to do that. You might need some supports getting that education, you might need some supports in your job, and you might need some supports living independently in the community. So that means that you're not, when you're 18, applying for AISH, which is living in poverty for the rest of your life, right? On a below the poverty line. I mean, if people need it, that's very good, but don't just assume that that's where people are going to end up. And that means people, where if you don't have this full participation, you're going to live in an institution. That's why our organization started over 40 years ago, because people were put in institutions told what to wear, what to eat, and what to do every day, when to get up. And they didn't want that. They wanted to have some control over their lives. They wanted to live independently, do the things that other people do, get married, have kids, live in the community, and have jobs and get an education. So the lack of education is really huge, because when you're being educated, you're getting your tools for life that will bring in your income. And so obviously if you're going to get an education, you have to have, what? Internet. How can you go through university nowadays without having some access to the internet, computers, and so on, things like that. A lack of an adequate income, if these barriers are in your way and you can't get that education, you can't get that job, you're going to live probably in poverty, and a lot of people with disabilities do live in poverty. When I put lack of support here, what I meant is personal care. Personal care attendance, there's a big issue in Alberta around home care, getting adequate home care. You know, it used to be 1 bath a week, right? Now they're trying to have 2 baths a week. Those are the standards for home care in Alberta, is that you get 1 bath a week. And so then they'll say to you, well, we're going to send you over at 10, send somebody from a company over at 10 o'clock on Friday morning, that's when you're having your bath. There's no flexibility, because maybe at 10 o'clock in the morning I'm going to be doing something else. I might be invited somewhere. No, I'm sorry, that's when you're back. So, one of the big points I'm trying to make here is flexibility in services and being able to have good support and the proper kind of support. And I just mentioned the next one is illness. So, illness is if you can't get preventative health care, like I asked my friend Larry, when was the last time he had an annual physical? He said, about 10 years ago. Because he can't get it. And so people don't go to the doctor, and then it gets worse and worse and worse. And I wouldn't even want to tell you some of the terrible situations on reserves about lack of dental and other care, people not being able to get to a dentist and having all their teeth abscessed and rotted, and one child even died from an abscessed tooth, because those services weren't available to those kids with disabilities on that reserve. So illness is a big part of it, and then of course you're fighting all the time to keep things going, to bring in an income, get an education, and so on, and then you're ill. So, and then lack of housing. With the Alberta Disabilities Forum, we've now started a working group on housing. I think in Calgary they have there's like 3,500 people waiting on waiting lists for housing. So if you don't have proper housing, if you're homeless or you don't have proper, we call it affordable, adaptable, and accessible housing, then where are you at? Like, how can you get an education, get a job if you don't even have a place to live that you can call home, where you can have some kind of a foundation to go and do whatever it is that you want to do. And of course, we talked about poverty. Our national group, Council of Canadians with Disabilities, had some statistics here about poverty, and they said up to 31% of people with disabilities live in poverty, depending on their situations, and 53.7% are living below the poverty line. So that is a lot of people. We know that people with disabilities are unemployed and underemployed and so on. So now I just want to talk about these consequences of these barriers to digital communication. So I was talking to our president yesterday. I was telling him what I was going to do here today, and he said he works in a bank, and he has a disability. So he said, well, just the cost of purchasing a computer. He said to get set up, wouldn't you need $1,000? Probably just to go and get set up for a computer. He said a minimum of $1,000. I don't know if that, maybe that's exaggerating. 500 to 1,000, depending on whatever you're getting. And of course, he said a lot of those people who's talking about his grant in particular doesn't have a credit card, where you can just go and charge up $1,000 like the rest of us would at a computer company. And so on top of that, you have to get an accessible computer depending on your disability. And then on top of that, you have to set up that computer. And believe me, if you aren't that way inclined, I don't know where you're going to be able to do it, because we've got tech guys around our office. They keep our computers going for us, and if our computers aren't working for 15 minutes, the staff are not happy, because how am I going to do my job today? Because we're all on computers all day long. And he's got the smarts. He does it all, thank goodness, because the rest of us are always kind of lost. So you got to set it up, and then you have to keep it current. Because half the time we're getting PDF files we can't open anymore because something or other's happened, because something's changed. The banks are changing the way they do things, government's changing, updating, so my computer has to be updated, and then on top of that, I've got to get trained on that computer, because that's not that easy. And so what are some of the other ones? Well, now I've noticed that they did that jelly bean test in the city of Edmonton last year, those colored jelly beans, and about voting online. We're going to be able to vote, and then I've got a little note in my mailbox just recently about registering online. And then also applying for a job. I mean, we put ads in all the time to get people to work at ACCD. All the resumes come in through email, and we never put it in the newspaper anymore. When I started, it used to be in the newspaper. We don't do that anymore, and I don't know how many people do. So everything is done digitally. I think you can book DAPs now online. Registering for any educational courses online, getting an education. Where would you be without internet to do your research and so on? Banking. I mean, I hardly ever go to a teller anymore. We do it all on a machine or online. And the other day, I went to renew my driver's license, and I got a note saying we will no longer be sending you anything in the mail to say your driver's license or your license plates in your car. We're going to say $3 million, because we're going to let you know digitally that your driver's license has to be updated. So there's another one. And then just working at a job, I just told you what's happening at our office. So now, so there are any questions? I don't know if I've got all my points across, but does anybody want to ask me anything at this point before we get into this legislation?
Yeah,
I just have a question and a comment, if that's... So in terms of my comment, it's interesting if you are raising awareness to the attitudes that people project onto persons that have disabilities. Just because a recent report on the reliability of Edmonton Transit came out, and spoiler, it's not a reliable service. And one of the auditor, I couldn't believe this in the news report, said that one of the main reasons that it wasn't reliable in terms of timing was because of persons that use mobility devices. And I was just wondering, like,
what do we think about that?
I mean, I couldn't believe that reading it, but...
Yeah, well, I guess the way just me personally, when I look at it is I want to know why he said that. So what is it that's happening there? Is it true? Is it holding up, or is it causing? What are the facts around that? Is that just something that somebody believes, or did it happen once, or how often is it happening, and what is the whole issue there? And then if it is an issue, that needs to be addressed one way or another. So I don't know what exactly he was referring to, but that would be my take on it.
Thanks. Okay, and then my question is, just I guess from a public policy perspective, in Alberta in the last the past budgets have specifically referred to vulnerable Albertans and protecting vulnerable Albertans, and in that umbrella is often, or it's usually persons with disabilities, and what I'm getting from today is that that's not really an accurate or positive way to kind of categorize persons with disabilities. So what would you suggest?
Well, I agree with that because, I mean, do we want to be categorized as vulnerable? Even, and I guess it depends a little bit. This just off the top of my head depends a little bit what they're talking about, because children can be vulnerable, seniors can be vulnerable, people with disabilities can be vulnerable, and that there's nothing wrong with that. But we wouldn't want to say, well, those people with disabilities are vulnerable people, because we don't want to be thought of as vulnerable people. In fact, when Nancy was speaking there, I thought, why do we even use the word disability? I don't even like that word anymore. We don't need to use that anymore. There are just differences in people, appreciating the differences in people. That's more the kind of thing that I'd like to be thinking of. We don't need to categorize, label people. So I guess they had well-meaning when they were saying that, looking after people who are vulnerable, but we certainly wouldn't want to be thought of as let's get some programs and services for those vulnerable people. So it's a little bit context too. Yeah. Okay, so I just talked a little bit about trying to impact legislation there for some of the health and medical services, and I found out that, boy, that would be really something to try to. We worked, I must have made 75 or 100 presentations to the AMA, the rural doctors, the individual doctors, half of the MLAs, a lot of public servants and so on about that, but we're raising awareness. But, it has to have more teeth than that. Obviously, if you don't have the awareness, you're not going to do anything about it. So, in 3 provinces across Canada, they've taken this to a higher level. And they really mean business. So, I hope that this PowerPoint will come through. But we'll talk a little bit. We'll start with Accessibility 2024 in British Columbia. Has anybody heard about this before? Some of you already know this? Oh, good. Then I am bringing some information. So they are being really aggressive about that. And I don't know how many of you have been on Vancouver walking down the street and you see how accessible they are. They made a real effort in Vancouver to be accessible. So December 3rd, 2013, the BC government had a consultation with people with disabilities and families and so on to share their thoughts about trying to increase accessibility. And in June, the next year, which is about 6 months later, the Premier came out with this Premier Releases Accessibility 2024, making BC the most progressive province in Canada for people with disabilities by 2024. Now that's 6 months. I don't know when I've ever seen government act that fast with something, like accessibility for people with disabilities. They had a real champion there. I think it's Carla Caltrop, who is a minister, who is now a politician and a minister in Ottawa. I think she had a lot to do with that. But BC, they have a plan, and they're carrying it out. So this means that they are going to measure the success of what they're doing. Cross-government commitments are going to improve accessibility in BC, and they already did a year progress. So they're saying, we put that in June 2014, June 2015, just what have we done? So they did a modernized Guide Dog Act, introduction of annual earnings exemption for people receiving assistance, launching a $3 million per year technology at work program to provide assistive technologies, and then this is one here, it says release of an update to reflecting our communities, building a diverse BC public service with an enhanced focus on accessibility. So that was where they're working, and they started, obviously they released an update, so I don't know what all that means, but, and then these are the 12 areas in BC that are included in their app. Inclusive government, accessible service delivery, accessible internet, accessible built environment, accessible housing, accessible transportation, income support, employment, financial security, inclusive communities, consumer experience, and emergency preparedness. And of course, they have tons and tons of goals and ways that they plan to do this. So I'm just telling you these are their 12 kind of building blocks. And I won't go through them all, but every one of them says, I've got some highlighted that I think we'd talk about here today. Accessible service delivery, their goal, BC services are the most accessible in Canada. Every single one of them is. Inclusive government, BC is the most inclusive government in Canada by 2024. Accessible internet. Internet access in BC is the most accessible in Canada by 2024. So every single one of them, we've got built environment, housing, transportation, income support, employment, financial security, consumer experience, and emergency preparedness. They're all going to be the most accessible in Canada by 2024. So they've set out a 10-year plan, and they are doing a yearly update to that, or a progress update to how they are doing in BC every year to meet their goals for accessibility. So then this other one is accessibility for Manitobans, and so they already have an act. And this comes from their disability office in Manitoba. And so the vision is accessible Manitoba, where all abilities are valued, diversity and independence are celebrated, barriers are removed, and human rights are protected. And this is an act. This BC is not in legislation yet, but this is already an act. And so this was, I guess, in 2013 when BC did this, became law. And so they've got I think it's 5 different areas. One is customer service, employment accessibility, information and communications, the built environment, and transportation. That's what they have in their Accessibility Act. And so there's a lot of more information that can be received from what they're doing there. And then the Ontarians with Disability Act, that started in 2005. Ontario, they've got an Ontarians with Disability Act that has been around for a long time, and we've all heard across Canada, why can't we be like Ontario? They have an Accessibility Act there. Look how much farther they had. We're not even talking about it here. What are they doing in Ontario? So it says it requires the government to adopt practices that eliminate barriers to participation for individuals with disabilities. And this is a really big one for us, and it was mentioned here this morning about practices are adopted by consultation with groups and individuals affected by or representing those with disabilities. So that's a big part for our community, is that where decisions are being made, we want to be at the table. We don't want any unanticipated, consequences for things that we could possibly do there. Government ministries and municipal government are required to prepare accessibility plans to identify, remove, and prevent barriers to their operations, throughout their operations. And there's a new act now, which includes both public and private. So I think what they found out was it's really good to say, yeah, let's have this Accessibility Act in Ontario because that's going to make all the difference. Well, no, it doesn't make all the difference because who's going to do it? Why are they going to do it? It might cost extra money. And so now they want a new act. And this new act is, it targets the removal of barriers, and they've got some other, is this all down? Yeah, it is, okay. So they've got customer service standard, integrated accessibility standard, communication, employment, transportation, and design of public spaces. And this is all being rolled out now, so it's a renewal and update of their original legislation, and it's tougher, a lot tougher, because evidently it wasn't, at least my opinion is it wasn't moving fast enough in Ontario. So I just wrote down here something I've researched. So the legacy of that in Northern Ontario is that a patron of a restaurant in Northern Ontario and her daughter were awarded $25,000 because the owner refused service to a patron who was accompanied by a registered service animal. So what I really think is in the future now, there's going to be a lot more litigation as it goes forward. People are, whether it be good or bad, if you don't provide accessibility, people are going to get sued because it's going to be in some of these acts. And I know in Ontario, I talked to a physician once who was building some kind of a facility, and he said, oh, it was a real pain. We had all those people with disabilities coming over there telling us what we needed to include in all this new facility. So their legislation is really making a difference, because you wouldn't want to go against it. But I do know from a conference I was at last year, they have all kinds of trouble, implementing it and keeping it going. But they certainly need business. So just as another note, there's this Barbara Turnbull. She's a quadriplegic reporter for Toronto Star, and she wrote in her book that the government of Ontario has no enacted sufficient standards, regulations to ensure full accessibility by 2025, and she is advocating for enforced mandatory standards. So that's the kind of thing that's going on across Canada. So recently with the Alberta Disabilities Forum, we had one of our forum meetings, and that's what we talked about that day. What's happening here in Alberta? We aren't even having the discussion in Alberta. No one's talking about accessibility legislation here that I know of. They come to us and say, are you working on this? So what I did was I looked up what is there for accessibility for Albertans. So then I just had to go and look at everything that came up. So this is what was considered on the internet to be accessibility for Albertans: was the adult guardianship, the ASHAC, the blind person's right to family support for children with disabilities, and then human rights, the Human Rights Act. That's what's considered accessibility. Well, I don't know how many of you have gone to the Human Rights Commission lately, if you know what happens there, but you're looking at 2 years if they accept it. They're underfunded and don't have enough staff and everything to look after the complaints that they do get. So I just had a few final thoughts. What am I doing for time? I'm good. I don't want to get between you and your lunch, so I'll try to end up. So on the news this morning, as I was getting ready to come here, there was somebody on who said access to the internet is now a necessity, it's not a luxury. And it is now, she thinks, it's a human right to have access to the internet. It's a universal need, and it should be treated the same as water and electricity. Because she has kids and she doesn't have a computer and they're in school and she doesn't have access for them. So that was really interesting. And for her, cost was the issue. That there just wasn't enough cost to have it in her home to get the hardware, the software, and to keep it up. And so one of the things that I just came across my mind is sometimes what we do is revamp that's already there. And sometimes when you're retrofitting, like whatever it is, a computer program or something like that, sometimes it's better if you can to start from scratch and build it in from scratch. Because sometimes just saying, well, we've got this over here, now we have to make it work with people with disabilities. I don't know if that always works. And I know we don't have the luxury of starting, things from scratch, but if that's possible, that's a really good thing. And I also think it would be good to have a disability lens, because I know a lot of you in this room are going to be working on some of these things, and if you had a disability lens that you could kind of lay over the service of the plan or whatever it is that you're doing. So it would have communication, it would have all those things that I talked about before, to see if you have them all incorporated into your plan. The Premier's Council on the Status of Persons with Disabilities actually have a disability lens that goes over ministry budgets, where you can take a look at that. I also just have a couple more things and then I'll end up. So one is, I just sometimes wonder if we really can do what it is we're saying that we want to do. So we have now been funded for an accessible hotel room. We're going to come up with an accessible hotel room, just like we did for an accessible medical facility, an examining room, a change room, a washroom. We came up with what we call an optimum doctor's office and everything around it. Washroom, change room, reception room, elevator, and entrance, parking and all that. And now we're going to try to come up with what is an optimum hotel room. But the thought across my mind is there such a thing as an accessible hotel room? Because what works for one person with a disability isn't going to work for another. So we're working with the hotel keepers now, and they want to say, yes, we have an accessible room. People with disabilities come here. And you go in there, and there is a plastic chair in a bathtub. And that's what they think is an accessible hotel room. I sit on the International Airport Accessibility Committee. We've spent a whole afternoon talking about toilet seat heights. Like, what works for one doesn't work for another. So I think that when we go to speak to the hotel keepers, this is what you have to do. You have to say, here's what we can offer people with disability when it comes to accessibility. We have this room, or these rooms, and this is what they have. And here's a picture. Here's the heights and everything on that website, so the person could see, will this work for my disability? Because for sure, if you say we have an accessible hotel room, there's going to be some disabilities it is not going to work for, and you're never going to win that battle. So of course you try to make it as accessible as possible for the majority of disabilities, taking into consideration everything you can, and then you put it on the website, and then people have to take responsibility too. People with disabilities have to take responsibility and check it out. Of course, that is if they have a computer and access and all these things we're talking about here today. And the other thing I want to just say about people with disabilities taking responsibility, when I came to ACCD, which is a long time ago now, I've been there 25 years, I was never allowed to put a picture of a person with a disability on a brochure. Because how dare you show that person, because that's going to evoke pity, and anybody that sees that. So you can do it if they're playing a game or they're sitting at a computer, but just not a picture of a person with a disability. And I used to think, well, are you ashamed? Well, we do not want to, have that evoking pity. So then we had some pictures of a person in a wheelchair with a basketball in his lap. And now he was, playing a game because he had a basketball in his lap. That was okay. So we've come a long way since then. People with disabilities should be everywhere, in every advertisement, on every board, every university board, every business, and so on, working in different places. And we sort of got away from that, but there's had to be a big change in the disability community too, in ways of thinking and coming along. And so the last thing I want to say is we have this slogan, I'm sure you've heard it, nothing about us without us. So if our organization, we do accessibility assessments for businesses, for occupancy. Every week we quote when we do that, we can come to your office for free. We'll come and we'll give it and do an accessibility assessment and give you some clues, especially if you're making any changes there. We can come in and talk to staff, do disability awareness. We've got all kinds of little videos. We've got quizzes that we do and that sort of thing, because the disability community really wants to be there when decisions are being made about things that affect our lives. I invited about 4 or 5 people here today, and Art would thankfully took me up on it, but I didn't give the others, I just wasn't able to put it together and I'm sorry that they aren't here. So that's all I have to say. So any questions, comments?
I'm always going to open one thing I think that's really important for this group to consider would be the concept of universal design. Having something that's accessible for everybody benefits everybody. One great example I had one time was a fellow who said that we were sitting in the lobby of a building downtown and noted how many people were using the automatic door, what people refer to as the handicap door. 90% of the people that he saw using it weren't displaying any kind of disability, but they had a stroller, they had briefcases, they had their arms full. It still enabled a lot of people a lot more convenience and a lot more easy access simply because it was there. And I was having a discussion with a gentleman beside me here today, and he was mentioning how in the digital world, it's now almost impossible to navigate the website if you don't have a mouse. So again, we get users who don't have very good use or hardly any use of their hands. Maybe they're using a stick and they're using a touch screen, but that whole design now has disenfranchised a group of people. So that it just boggles me to think of actually trying to do anything in your world. Because I'm not technically capable in a lot of ways, but I couldn't encourage you to try and be mind open and try and use universal design as much as possible.
Good. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bev and Nancy and Mark for a morning of simulating our thinking. And so now it's an opportunity to actually break till 1 o'clock and have some lunch, stretch your legs, and then come back and be prepared to unleash that thinking through a couple of breakout sessions. Marcel's described them. We'll remind you of them after lunch. But lunch will be served in the Wales room just outside in the lobby. The breakout sessions will also be held there. What we'll probably do at 1 o'clock is come back here, remind you of how the breakout sessions are going to happen. I'm not sure that we'll drag you back here between the breakout sessions. We might just do that out there. We'll have to figure out the logistics of that. Yeah, and then give you your instructions at 1 o'clock for what you're going to do for the next 45 minutes after that. So the next 45 minutes are yours to eat and chat and whatever.